Let us scream in one voice. No to the war, no to the 10th year. Imam Khalifa. This poem by Imam Khalifa was written in 1984 for a peace protest for the 10th year of the Lebanese Civil War. This poem holds value because of the relevance it has to the war, and the meaning and intention of peace behind it. This poem was one of many unheard voices all over Lebanon. Imam Khalifa was able to represent everyone in Lebanon who desired peace. This poem, however, was written 10 years after the war, so it is not a poem based on pure witness and experience and more. Before we dive into the Lebanese Civil War, let's have a little bit of a history about Lebanon itself. After World War I in 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was an agreement that had split up the land of the Ottoman Empire between France and Britain. Many people started to flee their countries. In the end, minority ethnic groups and religious groups would find themselves on a newly formed colonial border. This land would later be known as Lebanon. Lebanon from the beginning had been a multicultural country, and according to a study made by Culture Atlas, it was home to 18 religious groups. It is clear that the Lebanese government has been built to accommodate different religious groups. There is a widely common understanding of the government system. The country's system granted parliament seats based on religion. Here's the table that was in research conducted by Mustafa Dis. This table shows the distribution of seats in the Lebanese parliament. So Lebanon, starting from its government, has already started to create its own groups. Instead of Lebanese, you'll be classified based on your religion, then your nationality. This division between groups would eventually cause tension and lead to the Lebanese Civil War. The Lebanese Civil War started between Christians and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, but grew to be between different political parties and between the Muslims versus the Christians. There were other key players that contributed to the war. These would be Israel and Syria. One of the causes of the war is the difference of perspective that grew from being isolated from one another. When Israel was occupying Palestine, the Palestinians would eventually flee to other countries and at some point find themselves in southern Lebanon. As Palestinians grew in Lebanon, it caused political instability in the government, and as tension grew, a civil war would break out. The Lebanese Civil War started in 1975 and ended in 1990 when the Taif Agreement was signed for all parties to retreat. What makes us human? Is it our need to survive? Is it our ability to make our own decisions? Or is it the way we have emotion? There are two important things among many others that make anybody a human: human nature and human dignity. Human nature is an essential instinct required for a human to survive. According to John Locke, this consciousness is a state of nature characterized by human freedom and equality. Characteristics of human nature are being social, feeding, communication, and more. Human dignity is the standard of a human set through time. Human dignity can be affected by the government of the environment of a person and how they were raised. The American University in Beirut conducted a study that concluded Lebanese people generally feel their collectivist loyalty is strongest for their family. Their subsidiary group loyalties are then towards their religion, Lebanon as a nation, their ethnic group, and lastly, political party. This is just the human nature of being Lebanese. Their holistic collectivist loyalty towards their family and towards their religion. After 15 years of fighting in the war, An estimated of 120,000 people had died, and over 1 million people were injured. How did this affect the human dignity of the victims as Lebanese? How did they feel when their enemies are people of their own country? People who were sworn to protect them and later would be living with them as if nothing had happened. Here we have a Lebanese who will help answer our questions regarding human dignity and human nature. How old were you when you witnessed the war?
I was about 8 years old.
What are the key decisions made by past leaders that affected the course of the war?
There are many decisions or reasons, I would say, but the one that certainly stands out is the influx of a big number of people to the country without a proper plan to manage it, which over time led to create even more problems.
Have the victims been violated of their human rights?
I don't think there are any evidences that human rights are preserved in any war at all, because simply no one can be in every moment of a war. So human rights are certainly jeopardized, and how bad, how severe, all depends on the reality what happened. Certainly, this was not an exception. So human rights were severely violated.
How has human dignity been affected as a result of the war?
The most depends on people, but certainly everybody holds certain values close and dear to themselves, and among those is dignity, and that's probably one of the most been impacted in the war. You start from being having such high dignity and proud of yourself to become ashamed of even mentioning what has happened, and that takes a lot from you, not physically, not mentally, even just as a piece of you.
As a witness of the war, what are your observations on the change of human nature from before to after the war?
A war on itself is an ugly phenomenon, and especially the Civil War. And that's something well understood and communicated, yet people who witness and live war will know that better. It does impact the deep human nature. People who trusted each other as brothers become as enemies, and instead of trust become a threat. And you can imagine how much that can lead to disastrous consequences.
Was it a good decision for past leaders to start the war?
The decision to declare or start the war was bad, considering there were many countries surrounding it who were ready to make a move when it became vulnerable.
How do you think the human dignity of the civilians was affected as a result of the war?
Their human dignity was affected because they couldn't be proud of a country for a war that they brought upon themselves.
Were the civilians violated of their human rights?
Yes, because it was a war within the country, so the civilians weren't really protected.
Do you think human nature was the main cause of the war?
Yes, because it was their suspicion that the Muslims would overthrow in power that the tension caused the war.
After 30 years of the war, Lebanon is still suffering from the damages. It is currently going through an economic and political crisis. Lebanon still has the same political system, the same division between religion, and Lebanese still have the same collectivistic behavior. So after 30 years, what has changed? And was the fighting worth it? This video is to spread awareness about the cruelty of war, and especially civil wars. The point of a country is a society of people together, and a civil war just goes against what a country stands for. In a country, trust is important, and a civil war, all trust from civilians to governments are lost. The more we fight each other, the more divided we become. Trust must be built to move on. Please spread awareness about the risks of civil war and the danger it brings, the effect it has on human nature and our human dignity.